Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 281. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. I know you got some important Middle East news to talk about. I also got some stuff on Russia and China to get through before I hand the show over to you. Just want to quickly remind everyone that you can find all of our work at the Libertarian Institute at antiwar.com. And then by following myself, Connor, or the show on Twitter, the show is at con_interest. Connor is Freeman Minds 96, right?
Freeman's Mind, 96.
No S at the end there. And then I am Kyle Anzalone _. So thank you everybody so much for tuning in, and we will get into the news today. First up, Connor, a little bit of a follow-up of a story I've been covering for the past couple of weeks, and that is the indictment against Robert Menendez, the senator from New Jersey. And after Menendez was indicted, he stepped down, not from the Senate, but as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is one of, if not maybe the top 2 or 3 most important committee seats in the entire Congress. And so in that role, Menendez had a lot of power. And one of the things that they lay out in the indictment is if there's a military cell or any potential foreign aid that this chair objects to, the State Department will typically put a hold on that aid out of respect for that senator. And so now we have the Senator Ben Cardin, who has stepped into Menendez's seat, and he informed the State Department that he would like to withhold over $200 million in military aid earmarked for Egypt over concerns of Cairo's human rights abuses. So on Tuesday, Cardin told Secretary of State Antony Blinken that he plans to place a hold on a portion of military aid for Cairo until specific human rights progress is made. And so it's unclear if the State Department will grant this. As I said, I believe traditionally that is what happens, that they at least grant a temporary hold, if not, fully enforce it. Now, the other question that kind of remains, Connor, is how much aid is Cardin hoping to block? I believe of the 1.3 billion in aid the U.S. transfers to Egypt every year, about 3.2 billion, or not 3.2 billion, 320 million is set to be contingent on Egypt meeting certain human rights standards, which, of course, the government in Cairo does not do. And so they've already announced that they're redirecting $85 million of this aid from Cairo to Taipei. And so, of course, I'm not sure what Cardin wants to do with the rest of the money, if he'll follow that plan, or if he's talking about 300 million, or I think he said 235 million. And so I would think that means he's talking about the full 320 million that's supposed to be conditioned on human rights abuses. But it could be, half of that, at about 150 million, and he's just looking to cut it in half or something like that. So it's not exact. All the details of this are not exactly clear. So I just want to say, I'm not saying exactly the firm number because I don't understand it. Also mention here that the top Democrat in the House Foreign Affairs Committee bats Cardin's plan, and as Representative Gregory Meads, he wants to actually withhold the full $320 million. He has said that explicitly. Now, a part of the reason why this, should be a major and obvious issue to spot is that the State Department report on human rights in Egypt annually reports systematic atrocities committed by the Egyptian security forces. And, further, you have the president, Fattah al-Sisi, who has announced he will run for a third term as president. However, Egyptian elections are little more than a show. In the last election, Sisi's lone important opponent actually endorsed the general, and the rest of the political opposition was arrested or intimidated. And so this is interesting, Connor, of course, because we have sent over $100 billion to Ukraine because the American policy is to support democracies and fight against autocracies. And, as Donald Trump explicitly said, Sisi is his favorite dictator. So this is a dictator, and Biden just shoveling money and weapons at him has no problem with it. And of course, it's not like Biden is consistent on his democracy versus autocracy policy anyways, but this is just another glaring issue. All right, Connor, updates on the budget debate and how that's going to impact Ukraine. Now, I kind of assumed that breaking the budget from the Ukraine aid would be a benefit to the people who wanted to pass the Ukraine aid. Because when you're talking about the budget, especially right now, there's a lot of domestic issues that split Democrats and Republicans. And it sure seems to me there's still almost every single Democrat in both houses of Congress definitely supports sending more aid to Ukraine. And it seems that the vast majority of Republicans in both houses of Congress also still support sending aid to Ukraine. So you would assume that having a separate vote on the Biden aid package is going to, make it easier to pass, not harder to pass. However, the Biden said it does worry me, but I know there are majority members of the House and Senate in both parties who have said that they support funding for Ukraine. So what is the worry here? And I don't think it's absolutely nothing, because we also had this report from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Ukraine is freaking out over the lack of new U.S. aid from Congress. And so we have a Ukrainian member of parliament saying we are freaking out. For us, it's a disaster. Continuing, we are interested in getting things sorted out so the American democracy can function, and we will restore the bipartisan consensus on supporting their own national interests by supporting Ukraine. And so the only thing I could imagine, Connor, is that they're so terrified that this minority of Republicans will at least be able to sway the rest of the body to put in an inspector general overseeing the aid. And they know that once somebody comes and starts looking at it, they're going to be absolutely horrified at what the Biden administration has been doing and all the rules and supposed oversight that they're circumventing to get aid into Ukraine. And maybe even that they know that a lot of this aid is absolutely being stolen and going to corrupt sources, military supplies, going to neo-Nazis. And so that they're panicked that this is going to be the situation where they have to at least allow a thorough inspections regime, somebody independent like a John Sopko, who did a pretty good job of overseeing Afghan reconstruction. I mean, he didn't obviously really have an impact on ending the American war, but as far as exposing corruption goes, and that, what the White House and Pentagon were trying to claim as far as successes in Afghanistan were really not happening as they said. Maybe this is what's going on here, Connor. So other news, my understanding is that so it appears that Jim Jordan is a potential to replace Kevin McCarthy as House Speaker. And if it is Jim Jordan, which I really doubt, but if it is, then there maybe is a real possibility that he could at least deprioritize the Ukraine aid and hold it up a little bit more. But Steve Scalise is running against him, and I really imagine that Scalise will end up taking on the Speaker of the House role. Now, there are other issues for Ukraine that are probably actually more pressing than Congress passing this aid package or not. Because as I explained on the last show, Connor, if you look at them finding a $6 billion accounting error and the fact that they're really not tracking the weapons going to Ukraine anyways, I'm sure they could, if there was consensus and weapons in the American stockpiles to send to Ukraine, they could continue sending weapons to Ukraine, and they would. But we have now Germany denying Ukraine cruise missiles, and so this is just another setback for Ukraine. A German newspaper reported that Berlin has no near-term plans to send Kiev TARS cruise missiles, and the rejection follows a string of admissions by Western countries about their ability to arm Ukraine, and that is nearing an end. The Bild newspaper reported that Germany was unwilling to send TARS missiles to Ukraine out of a fear that Kiev would use the munitions to target the Kerch Bridge. The bridge is linked southern Russia with the Crimean Peninsula, and the Kremlin views it as critical infrastructure. Ukraine has targeted the Kerch Bridge on multiple occasions. Successful operations against the roadway have resulted in Moscow escalating its targeting of Ukrainian infrastructure. Moscow views Kiev's attacks on its territory as direct Western interference or warfare against Russia. Recently, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov blasted the U.S. for waging a proxy war in Ukraine. He said, no matter what it says the U.S. controls the war. It supplies the weapons, munitions, intelligence information, data from satellites. It is pursuing a war against us. And so, Germany seems to be looking to hold back their support some. And as I've talked about earlier this week on the show, Connor, Poland says they're not giving any more weapons. The Slovakian party that won the plurality in the country's election says they don't want to send more weapons. Budapest has turned entirely against Kiev. We have a report saying that the British are out of weapons to send to Ukraine. The American stockpile of artillery rounds and ATACMS are so depleted that we can't send those to Ukraine. And we had a Dutch admiral, Rob Brouwer, he's a NATO official, warning that the bottom of the barrel can now be seen as far as the weapons that the West has that they could potentially send to Ukraine. So I guess out of major desperation, the Pentagon announced Wednesday that it had transferred a shipment of ammunition that it seized, that it claims was Iranian, that it seized. They, I think, claimed that it was supposed to go to the Houthis in Yemen, which who knows if that report is even true or not, but that's what they claim. And so they said they took 1.1 million 7.262 millimeter rounds and sent those to the Ukrainian forces. So it seems more like a PR headline, but it also looks like quite a bit of desperation to me, Connor. Next up here, Russia says it repelled a massive drone attack on Russian border regions. And so this is concerning because these attacks have been increasing as the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, and Russia has increasingly been more and more vocal that not only are they, going to escalate because of these attacks, but they're increasingly upset with Ukraine's Western backers and believe those countries are waging direct war on Moscow. Connor, just a couple stories on China before I hand it over to you. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says China threatened U.S.-led liberal world order. He thinks that China is trying to become the dominant world power and wants to replace the U.S.-led liberal world order. And this, seems more like anxiety to me than actual legitimate fear. If you look at China and, what they're capable of achieving and what they look to be doing, it's far more trade relationships with other countries and then within their sphere of influence, their region, which will include Taiwan, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, and that region of Southeast Asia. They do want to have a lot of power and say of what goes on in that region, but they're certainly not looking to become a global power. And really, it's Washington that wants to be able to control every decision that's made in every world capital. So we have a decades-old U.S. Marshall Islands Agreement elapsing with negotiations ongoing. Of course, the Marshall Islands were the subject of nuclear warfare by the United States. I mean, we talk about nuking Japan twice, and of course, those were war crimes, and those intentionally killed a lot of people. But the U.S. nuked the Marshall Islands 67 times. So, these people have faced a significant bombing campaign from the United States that, these are all tests, of course, these nuclear weapons detonations, they were tests, but certainly fallout and just the impact on the region and the environment, I'm sure has been absolutely massive. And so we'll see what comes out of it. This is one of those weird things where you have countries that are legitimate victims of America, like the Marshall Islands, that have been their islands have been used for nuclear weapons tests. And we can never seem to find a whole lot of money to send to them, and we play hardball when they want to sign agreements with us. But when it's Saudi Arabia, a country that the U.S. should have no interest in signing an agreement with, in those cases, it seems that they have endless money to throw at the Saudis or these other countries in the world. And so rather than rectifying past mistakes with, the money that they're going to give away, it seems that it only goes to future warfare. All right. U.S. Philippines begin annual naval drills amid tensions with China. So, of course, this is going to ramp up the tensions. This year marks the seventh and largest ever iteration of the Sama drills, which comes as the U.S. and the Philippines are strengthening their alliance with more than 1,800 personnel taking part in the drills. And there are participants from Australia, Canada, France, Japan, the UK, and Malaysia. The exercises will be conducted off Philippines' east coast, near the capital city, and according to the U.S. Navy, the exercises will include drills on anti-submarine, surface and air warfare, and land phases. So a lot of drills going on here, and of course, this comes as the Philippines is really pushing China on some of these territorial issues in the South China Sea. And not that, I'm saying I think the U.S. should back and support Beijing's claims to the South China Sea, but we also shouldn't be backing the Philippines' claims either. All right, so Taiwan tells the U.S. to speed up weapons deliveries. This is always interesting as the U.S. is desperately searching for weapons to send to Ukraine. There is a movement within the U.S. and the loudest voices and some of the people that we are encouraging right now to try to cut aid to Ukraine are all very concerned about this issue that we're not getting enough weapons to Taiwan, which is really disappointing, Connor, because you would think that now more than ever, it would be really obvious to people that what they want to do with Taiwan is what they think they are successfully doing to Russia in Ukraine, which is they think that they could use the Taiwanese people as a military base to attack and weaken China. Because as we started off on today's show, a huge part of what the Biden administration is most concerned about is Beijing trying to dominate the globe. All right, last story up here today. Saudi Arabia, China to hold second ever joint naval exercises. And it's this really interesting thing again, where, some countries, they do anything, even remotely, increasing ties with China, and they're going to be, subject to, at the very least, threats and, rhetorical insults. But, maybe even sanctions or further, different kinds of punishments, revocation of some kind of aid that Washington gives those countries. But when it's Saudi Arabia that is buddying up with China and carrying out war games with China, then it's like it encourages the Biden administration to work harder to appease Riyadh in order to get them to hate China and be friends with Washington. It's a very strange policy, and it's a very, very difficult White House to pin down exactly what kind of agile interests they're pursuing and why. Connor, with that, I want to hand it over to you and let you update us on the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to start by discussing this recent strategic partnership that was announced by President Xi Jinping while Bashar al-Assad was visiting his Chinese counterpart in Beijing. So this is from Middle East Eye on September 23rd. So Chinese President Xi and his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad announced that they would upgrade relations to a strategic partnership. The announcement was made following Assad's first official visit to China in almost 2 decades in what was a rare trip abroad for the Syrian president. Xi told Assad, according to a readout from state broadcaster CCTV, that, quote, "Today we will jointly announce the establishment of the China-Syria Strategic Partnership, which will become an important milestone in the history of bilateral relations." The announcement was made by the Chinese president in the southern city of Hangzhou, which is hosting the Asian Games over, this was obviously about a couple weeks ago, but over the next 2 weeks at the time. So, quote, "Faced with international situation full of instability and uncertainty, China is willing to continue to work together with Syria, firmly support each other and promote friendly cooperation and jointly defend international fairness and justice." Now, relations between the two nations have withstood the test of international changes, Xi said, adding that the friendship between the two countries has been strengthened over time. So the strategic partnership between China and Syria is one rung below what Beijing calls a comprehensive strategic partnership. In a swipe at the West, Xi went on to say that China supports Syria's opposition to foreign interference, unilateral bullying, and will support Syria's reconstruction. So that's very good to hear, obviously, because it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country, and they're under such stiff sanctions from the Americans. And so hopefully the Chinese will just bypass that, especially the Caesar Act, which is deliberately keeping Syria in rubble. And so in a swipe at the West, by offering Assad a financial lifeline, the Chinese president is hoping to further extend Beijing's recent diplomatic successes in the region. Especially real peace deal, actually, not a phony normalization agreement like the Abraham Accords between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And she had said that China is willing to strengthen cooperation with Syria through the Belt and Road Initiative to make positive contributions to regional and world peace and development. So I mean, they're just talking more or less about the sanctions and the war. But this is very good to see. Of course, more recently, normalization efforts propelled by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have sped up dramatically, with both countries looking to bring Damascus back into regional affairs. And earlier this year, Syria's welcome back into the Arab League, where it had been suspended from it since the war began in about a decade ago. So that's good news to see that China is willing to buck the United States. And of course, this is a part of this running theme we're seeing now as our foreign policy, or the apparatchiks running it, everything is sort of blowing up in their face as the multipolar world is emerging, and all these unipolar moment strategies seem to be failing and going up in flames. So, but unfortunately, that's the only good news I have on Syria. I have a lot of bad news, actually, about Syria this week. So this is from Dave DeCamp on October 3rd. 2 Syrian soldiers wounded by Israeli airstrikes in Syria's Deir ez-Zor. So at least 2 Syrian soldiers were wounded in an Israeli airstrike in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province late Monday night. Syrian state media reported at approximately 11:50 p.m. today, Monday, October 2nd, 2023, the Israeli enemy carried out an air attack on some of our armed forces positions in the vicinity of the city of Deir ez-Zor. And this was from a military source speaking with the Sana'a news agency. So the source said that on top of the 2 wounded soldiers, there was some material damage as well. No details have been provided on what the Israeli strikes had targeted. This marks at least the 25th time Israel has bombed Syria this year. The Deir ez-Zor province is partially controlled by the Syrian government to the east of the Euphrates River. The province is occupied by U.S. forces and the U.S.-backed Kurdish-led SDF. And in recent weeks, of course, as we've been talking about, the SDF has been fighting with Arab tribes who oppose Kurdish rule in the region. While Israel frequently bombs Syria, it rarely comments on individual airstrikes. Israeli officials frame their operations as attacks on Iran or Hezbollah in Syria, and they're often killing or injuring Syrians and damaging civilian infrastructure, including deliberately bombing international airports, as we've seen so many times in Aleppo, as well as Damascus. They completely they bombed the Aleppo airport and put it out of service 3 times. I believe actually 4 times in the last couple of years, but especially in the wake, it happened 3 times in the wake of that devastating earthquake back in February that hit Turkey and Syria. So now this next story is about what's going on in Deir ez-Zor with the Kurds and also these Arab tribesmen in these clashes. And it's starting to look like, and the UN is even acknowledging this, that the SDF is waging an ethnic cleansing campaign. So that's what this story is about. Thousands displaced by clashes between SDF, Arab tribes in U.S.-occupied Syria. So according to the UN, around 6,500 families have been displaced by recent clashes between the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces and Arab tribesmen in Deir ez-Zor, who have been leading a rebellion against the Kurdish militia since August. This is from the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. In a report last month, they said, quote, approximately 6,500 families have been displaced to government areas. Essential services were impacted due to hostilities, and the fighting has led to shortages in food, water, and medicine. So the pro-government newspaper Ather Press claimed on October 3rd that the SDF is barring the displaced from returning to their homes. Quote, the SDF is trying to obstruct the return of people to their villages and towns in the Al Jazeera region who were displaced due to clashes between it and fighters from the region's tribes, the newspaper said. The Kurdish group has been accused of facilitating demographic changes favoring northern Syria's Kurdish population. Now, Ather Press adds that the SDF is also conducting a large-scale arrest campaign since the fighting erupted. So heavy clashes between the SDF and the formerly allied Arab tribes began on August 27th when the SDF arrested Abu Kwala, an allied commander of the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, and 4 of his colleagues. So the DEMC is an Arab tribal-led military organization affiliated with the Kurdish militant group, or formally. And the SDF has accused Kwala of corruption, drug trafficking, and collaboration with the Syrian government. Interestingly, those same charges have been laid by the Arab tribesmen against the Kurds, just not this idea that they're collaborating with the Syrian government. Now, Arab tribal fighters led by Sheikh Ibrahim al-Hafal of the Akadat tribe rebelled against the SDF, seeking to end Kurdish domination of the Arab regions east of the Euphrates. Much of the recent fighting has between the tribal forces and the SDF has centered around this town, Diban, or Ziban, as it's also been called in several reports, as we were discussing last week. Encompasses areas on both sides of the Euphrates. Now, Diban was briefly captured by Arab tribes and reclaimed by the SDF in early September. However, SDF forces in the town continue to face attacks by the tribes. Of course, al-Hafal is encouraging more and more tribes to join in this fight to try and take the town back. And so, according to the SDF, the Arab fighters who entered Diban received artillery cover from areas under the control of Damascus. And so there's the accusation that this is a deliberate destabilization campaign by Assad. Now, the tribal rebellion against the SDF is ongoing. Late on October 2nd, tribal forces launched a massive attack on SDF positions, targeting around 13 checkpoints and headquarters. Local sources told Mayadeen 1 day earlier out their press reported that Hafal had established a new tribal military force named Sakur al-Asher. And so, I mean, this is just, once again, proving the fact that the occupation in Syria is just untenable, and it's a powder keg waiting to go off. And of course, there was a bombing in Ankara recently, and that's driving up tensions, and Turkey is beginning to carry out attacks in northern Iraq against the Kurds as well as Syria. There's been some reports of that happening today. And that's where we get into this next story, which broke at the Wall Street Journal this morning. But this piece is from Reuters, is written by Idris Ali. So a U.S. jet reportedly shot down a Turkish drone in Syria, according to officials. So the United States on Thursday shot down an armed Turkish drone that was operating near its troops in Syria, U.S. officials said. The first time Washington said it brought down an aircraft of NATO ally Turkey. A Turkish Defense Ministry official said the drone was shot down by the U.S.-led coalition a Turkish Defense Ministry official said that the drone shot down by the U.S.-led coalition did not belong to Turkish armed forces, but they didn't say whose property it was. So 2 U.S. officials speaking on the condition of anonymity said that an F-16 had shot down the drone after the United States called Turkish military officials multiple times to warn them they were operating close to U.S. ground forces. The official said that the Turkish drone was believed to be armed. Now, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which supports the opposition to Assad, and a local security source said the U.S.-led coalition had shot down a Turkish drone near a base in northeastern Syria. U.S.-allied Syrian Kurdish forces said that Turkish attacks had killed 8 people in an escalation prompted by this bombing in Ankara, which was carried out by the PKK. So, U.S. support for Kurdish forces in northern Syria has long caused tension with NATO allied Turkey, which views them as a wing of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, which, of course, the U.S. and the EU view as a terrorist group as well. Now, that group claimed Sunday's attack in Ankara near government buildings. So on Wednesday, Ankara said that the 2 attackers had come from Syria. The bombing killed both attackers and wounded 2 police officers, and the SDF denied the bombers had passed through its territory. On Thursday, a Turkish Defense Ministry official said that a ground operation into Syria was one option Turkey could consider. And Turkey has mounted several previous incursions into northern Syria against the YPG. So this official said, our only goal is to eliminate the terrorist organizations that pose a threat to Turkey. A ground operation is one of the options to eliminate this threat, but it's not the only option open to us. Security forces in Syria, northeastern Syria, have said that Turkey launched a series of attacks on Thursday with more than 15 drones entering the region's airspace and hitting targets including infrastructure and gas and oil stations. And I'm sure when they say security forces, they're referring to the SDF. So in a statement, the security force, or potentially U.S. troops, it's unclear, but in a statement, the security forces said that Turkish attacks killed 6 members of the internal security forces in northeast Syria. I think it's got to be the Kurds then. So two civilians in two separate strikes. Turkey has redoubled its operations targeting the outlawed PKK, carrying out airstrikes in northern Iraq as well. What's interesting is, of course, the U.S. and the Kurds control some oil and gas fields in northeastern Syria, in Deir ez-Zor province, where the U.S. illegally occupies this territory. And so Turkey is threatening that they're going to start attacking that infrastructure, and they're saying that any allies or partners of the Kurds, regardless of what nation you're from, get the hell out of the way. You should be taking precautions right now. So they say the defense ministry official said that those energy facilities and infrastructure that's controlled in Iraq and Syria by the PKK or the YPG are legitimate military targets. They said that the same terrorist organization, they are a legitimate target everywhere. Turkey conducted operations whenever and wherever necessary in the past, and these operations will continue if needed again. So these operations are being conducted under self-defense rights arising from international law to eliminate terrorist attacks on Turkish territory and ensure border security. So so they're saying we're calling on all parties, our friendly and allied countries in particular, to stay away from those terrorists. This is just a reminder. It's up to them to take necessary precautions without naming any country. So this is still a developing story. I know that Austin and several other defense officials are going to be getting on the phone and just talking with Turkish defense ministry officials and trying to smooth this over. But this is just another example. I mean, you have both the U.S. and Turkey backed the al-Qaeda militants against Assad in the dirty war that killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed Syria. And now they're still there, occupying territory. I mean, this is another reason why all this rhetoric from NATO, at least Stoltenberg is being more honest lately, saying we provoked the war. But all this lofty rhetoric you hear from these men like Stoltenberg or like General Milley, recently retired, all this stuff about how we have to protect, because larger nations attack smaller nations and they violate international law and they take territory and they invade these countries illegally. And it's, the international rules-based order, we can't tolerate this kind of behavior. And that's what makes Russia so evil. It's just a complete lie. I mean, Russia was invited there to destroy the Islamic State along with Iran and Hezbollah, and they've nearly done that. Unfortunately, the U.S. and Turkey still supports groups like that in the Idlib province, and we're still, we've taken a third of their country, stealing, as I said, their energy resources as a part of this economic war, keeping 90% of the population in Syria below the poverty line, or helping anyway with our sanctions as well. So. It's a powder keg, and it's just, this would be a great time for Matt Gaetz to introduce another resolution to get U.S. troops out of Syria. Now, back to the Saudis. This is a report from Dave DeCamp on October 1st. So this is from Reuters. This is Dave wrote this piece up. Saudis determined to get defense pact with U.S. for Israel normalization. So it really does look like at least according to these reports, is Saudi. And, I think that it became much clearer when MBS did that interview on Fox News, I believe with Brett Baer the other week, where he said that every day we get closer to this normalization agreement with Israel. And he personally denied these reports that when basically that the Saudis had pulled out of these talks regarding normalization and recognizing Tel Aviv over the treatment of the Palestinians and Itmar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and these extremist settlers in the government who are hell bent on annexing the West Bank. That he personally said that is not going to prevent this deal from happening effectively. So Dave writes, Saudi Arabia is determined to secure a defense pact with the U.S. in exchange for normalizing with Israel, regardless of whether or not concessions are made to the Palestinians. And this was from a Reuters report Friday, and citing regional sources. Riyadh is looking for a commitment to the U.S. That it would defend Saudi Arabia if it comes under attack, similar to NATO's Article 5, which outlines that an attack on one alliance member is treated as an attack on all. The U.S. is not looking to go as far as an Article 5 style guarantee, but the Reuters report said that Saudi Arabia would not settle for less than binding assurances of U.S. protection if it faced attack. A formal U.S. mutual defense guarantee for Saudi Arabia would risk reigniting the war in Yemen, where a ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis has held relatively well since April of 2022. Such a commitment from the U.S. also risks sparking another war, as it would embolden Riyadh in the region. Saudi officials previously said that normalizing with Israel hinges on Palestinians being granted statehood. They have backed down on that demand. The Saudis are still paying lip service to Palestinian concerns, but the Reuters report said that it's really not a priority for Riyadh. Quote, the normalization will be between Israel and Saudi Arabia. If the Palestinians oppose it, the kingdom will continue in its path, one of the regional sources told Reuters. So Saudi Arabia, quote, Saudi Arabia supports a peace plan for the Palestinians, but this time it wanted something for Saudi Arabia, not just for the Palestinians. So as usual, in any of these kind of deals, the Palestinians are getting thrown under the bus. And, it looks like they're discarding the Arab peace plan. And they're going to recognize Tel Aviv because Saudi Arabia has so much leverage in these talks. It's not even funny compared to the White House. As you said, Kyle, they're really desperate to make this happen for a number of reasons. And, the security guarantee, it's disturbing that that's the primary goal here for Riyadh, because that does spell a lot of trouble for Yemen, which we should. A peace deal should have already happened, but the U.S. has, of course, been slow walking the process and not using any of it. It does have considerable leverage with Saudi to wrap that up. They could just make a commitment that we will absolutely not support you militarily or otherwise with intelligence or diplomatic cover or anything, logistics, if fighting resumes here in Yemen. But of course, the Biden administration is not going to do that because it would disturb these negotiations that they're pretty much doing on behalf of the Israeli apartheid state, even though they have their own reasons for doing it. We want to curtail China's influence in the region and get a diplomatic win before the election. But and Saudi Arabia is also seeking increased access to advanced American weapons and assistance in building a civilian nuclear program. And of course, Israel has killed well over 200 Palestinians this year, and they just in the West Bank and East and Gaza and East Jerusalem as well. And there's just been more settler attacks, and there was just another raid in the West Bank that killed, I believe, 2 Palestinians today, or today or yesterday, and it's just been. These powers in the region in the United States, they just don't give it. They don't care about Palestine. It's just used as a chip to try and get these deals done. And so now this piece I just wanted to wrap up with. I wrote this piece for antiwar.com about General Milley retiring. There's all this fanfare about him being, a never Trumper or an anti-Trump kind of force. The Democrats have celebrated. He took a big shot at Trump in his retirement speech when he was handing over power to General Charles Q. Brown, who was now formerly the chief of the Air Force, chief of staff of the Air Force. And he said that, we take an oath to the Constitution, not to any wannabe dictator or whatever. And so, I make the point that every war this guy ever fought or was involved with was illegal and unconstitutional and undeclared. But there's a section here in the article about Milley's legacy in the Middle East, which I think is instructive. So I write that in Syria, Milley championed Washington's indefinite and illegal occupation over large swaths of the eastern parts of the war-torn country, where the U.S. controls about a third of Syria, stealing the oil and wheat resources as part of this economic war against Damascus. You have 900 troops there backing the Kurdish-led SDF. We have these ethnic tensions and violent clashes going on between the Arab tribesmen and the Kurds, which threatens to upend the whole situation there, this whole occupation. And as CENTCOM Chief General Michael Eric Kurilla has conceded previously, American troops' unwanted presence is also becoming more dangerous and creating a climate for escalation between U.S. and Russian forces, of course, for so many close calls and confrontations between Russian aircraft and American aircraft, as well as ground troops. And so we've had and there's been dozens of attacks by ostensibly Iranian-backed groups. It's always just blamed on Iran. But a lot of these are just local militias or Shiite militias who are just, they oppose the American occupation and these invading forces. Nevertheless, Milley has never advocated for a withdrawal or even a reduction in troop levels. Instead, as he leaves his post, another base is being built in the northern province of Raqqa. Now, earlier this year, Milley told Congress that U.S. forces would begin, quote, harshly targeting members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps in Syria, which would, of course, lead to a hot war with Iran. He said, we need to be targeting the IRGC Quds force and targeting them very harshly over time. That's exactly what we plan on doing, Milley declared. And, of course, after Trump kicked off 2020 with the brutal illegal drone strike assassination at the Baghdad International Airport of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the Iraqi parliament demanded that all U.S. forces leave the country. And of course, the American troops were never removed. Once again, showing how full of it Milley is when he's laying out all of his, as I said earlier, this rhetoric about China and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and how the U.S. stands for individual sovereignty, or excuse me, national sovereignty. And it's just a complete lie. And so Washington's wars in the post 9/11 era have killed 4.5 million people overseas and cost Americans trillions of dollars. Despite these realities, in August, Milley boasted, "I can't imagine the United States would ever walk away from the Middle East. I think we'll remain committed for many, many years and decades to come." In 2021, during the end of Washington's withdrawal from Afghanistan after the failed 20-year war and occupation left about 250,000 people dead, the infamous U.S. drone strike on a home in Kabul slaughtered 10 civilians, including 7 children. U.S. officials claimed the strike targeted an ISIS-K suspect who was planning a terrorist attack. Instead, Zamari Ahmadi, an aid worker employed by a California-based NGO, along with 9 members of his family, were killed in the August 29th strike. Almost immediately, evidence mounted that non-combatants had been murdered, but the administration and the military chose to promote it as a success as long as possible. Milley was emphatic, quote, "The procedures were correctly followed and it was a righteous strike." Months later, Lieutenant General Sammy said the Air Force Inspector General led a review which said the killings were not the result of any misconduct or negligence, and there was no need to hold anyone involved accountable. And at the time, Milley's successor, General Brown, was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So I just write that Milley's legacy here is the completely broken foreign policy that has defined the new American century. The Wolfowitz Doctrine will continue sputtering out as the multipolar world realities supplant unipolar moment fantasies. Washington can be expected to continue chaotically lashing out at the so-called revisionist powers as they're described in our national defense strategy, Russia and China, until America is bankrupt or nuclear weapons are launched. Milley has never tried to save his countrymen or his military from this destruction. He could always be counted on to do what was best for his own selfish interests. He will be celebrated by the corporate press every time he excoriates Trump as a wannabe dictator and talks up his oath to the Constitution. But of course, as I said, the man's been acting illegally pretty much his whole career here, since we haven't declared war since the end of the Second World War. And next, he may find himself a comfortable seat on the board of Raytheon or Lockheed. May even make a presidential run or get a nice cushy job over at CNN. Regardless, history will be ruthless in its appraisal of the man who co-bylined an imperial agenda destined to culminate in a third world war. Because as much as he, talked a good game about, escalations with China, and my role was to de-escalate, he oversaw the worst escalations in the Asia pivot under Trump and under Biden. I mean, he was chief of staff, a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 4 years. So these policies that we've seen, the provoking Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and then carrying out this brutal proxy war that now has us on the brink of a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, as well as this buildup for war with China, which has us not far off from there with Beijing. Milley has bylined this as much as anybody, and so good riddance. But unfortunately, there's a lot of Milleys around. He's not exceptional, and he's pretty disposable. He does what he's told, but I think it was important to get the message out that this is not in any, because he's been highly politicized. And so it's important to look at what his real effect was on foreign policy and on the future of the United States.
Well, absolutely, Connor. Saying Milley is not impressive is maybe the understatement of your article there. But thank you so much for all the work you've been doing, particularly that Milley article. Was really solid, because there was a lot of hysteria around Milley leaving the Post. In fact, the conservative media tried to make it out to be like he got canned or something. A long planned retirement was Milley suddenly, breaking news, Milley suddenly retires, leaves the military, his military post. And it's very strange. So thank you for all the context around that, and really why we should hate Mark Milley. And everybody, just check out the show, share the show if you can, and keep an eye on antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, for all the work me and Connor do.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.